The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Corsham as Margaret Fletcher adjusted her thick woolen coat and checked her watch for the third time. At 78, she had seen many royal visits to their small Wiltshire town, but today felt different. Today carried the weight of memory and the promise of closure that had been decades in the making. Margaret's weathered hands trembled slightly as she clutched the faded photograph of her father, Squadron Leader James Fletcher, who had been stationed at RAF Corsham during the darkest days of World War II. The black and white image showed a young man in his flying jacket, his smile bright despite the shadows of war that loomed over Britain in 1943. He had been just 24 when his Spitfire went down over the English Channel, his body never recovered, his sacrifice never properly honored in his hometown until now. The town square buzzed with quiet activity as residents gathered early, each carrying their own stories, their own connections to the memorial that would soon receive its final tribute. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the town historian, moved through the crowd with purposeful steps, her clipboard filled with names and stories she had spent months collecting. At 85, she remembered the war years with crystal clarity, when Corsham had been transformed from a sleepy market town into a crucial hub of Britain's war effort. Eleanor paused beside Margaret, recognizing the photograph immediately. She had interviewed Margaret several times over the past year, documenting the stories behind each name that would be inscribed on the memorial. The process had been emotional for everyone involved, but particularly for the families like Margaret's, who had waited so long for their loved ones to be properly remembered. The memorial itself stood 20 feet tall, carved from Portland stone quarried from the same region where many of the fallen had trained before deployment. Local craftsman David Morrison had spent 8 months creating the structure, his skilled hands guided by stories shared by families and survivors. Each detail had been carefully considered, from the RAF wings etched into the stone to the subtle reliefs depicting various branches of military service that had operated from the area. David stood near his creation now, running his fingers along the smooth stone surface that had consumed his thoughts and dreams for the better part of a year. He had known from the beginning that this would be more than just another commission. When the town council had approached him about creating a memorial for their Second World War dead, he had felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The project had begun with a simple request from the Corsham Heritage Society. For decades, the town had lacked a proper memorial to honor the men and women who had served during World War II. While larger cities had their monuments and annual ceremonies, Corsham's contributions to the war effort had been largely forgotten by history, known only to the dwindling number of residents who remembered those turbulent years. Eleanor Hartwell had been the driving force behind the memorial project. Her research had uncovered forgotten stories of heroism and sacrifice that had taken place in and around their quiet town. RAF Corsham had been a vital training base for fighter pilots, while the nearby underground facilities had housed crucial government operations during the Blitz. Hundreds of young men and women had passed through Corsham during the war years, many never to return home. The memorial project had taken 3 years from conception to completion. Eleanor had worked tirelessly to gather names, verify service records, and contact surviving family members. She had spent countless hours in archives, tracking down information about servicemen whose records had been lost or damaged over the decades. Each name on the memorial represented hours of detective work, phone calls to distant relatives, and emotional meetings with elderly widows and children who had grown up without fathers. Margaret Fletcher's story was typical of many Eleanor had encountered. Her father had been stationed at RAF Corsham for only 6 months, but the family had remained in the area after his death. Margaret had grown up knowing her father only through stories told by her mother and the few photographs that survived the war years. For 75 years, she had carried the weight of his absence, the what-ifs, and might-have-beens that haunted the families of the missing. The memorial project had given Margaret and dozens of other families a focus for their grief and pride. Regular meetings at the parish hall had become informal therapy sessions, where elderly residents shared stories they had kept locked away for decades. The process had been cathartic for the entire community, bringing to light connections and shared experiences that had been lost to time. As the morning progressed, more residents gathered in the square. Children from the local primary school arrived with their teachers, having spent weeks learning about World War II and the role their town had played in Britain's victory. Young faces looked up at the memorial with curiosity and respect, representing a new generation who would carry these stories forward. The Reverend Michael Thornton moved through the crowd, offering quiet words of comfort to families who were experiencing a mixture of emotions. As the parish priest, he had officiated at many funerals over the years, but today was different. Today was about celebration as much as mourning, about honoring lives rather than simply remembering deaths. The planning for today's ceremony had been meticulous. When Buckingham Palace had confirmed that Queen Camilla would attend to place the final floral tribute, the small organizing committee had been both thrilled and terrified. None of them had experience with royal visits, and the security requirements alone had been overwhelming. Police officers had been arriving since dawn, discreetly positioning themselves around the square while trying to maintain the intimate atmosphere the organizers had wanted. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, who had been assigned to coordinate local security, had worked closely with the royal protection officers to ensure that the ceremony could proceed naturally while maintaining appropriate safety measures. The choice of Queen Camilla to perform the final tribute had been particularly meaningful to the community. Her own family connections to military service resonated with many of the residents who would be watching today. More importantly, her genuine interest in military history and veterans' causes had been evident throughout the planning process. Rather than simply making an appearance, she had requested detailed background information about the memorial and the stories behind the names inscribed on it. Local businessman Peter Ashworth had been instrumental in funding the memorial project. His grandfather had served as a ground crew member at RAF Corsham, maintaining the aircraft that carried young pilots like Squadron Leader Fletcher into combat. Peter's family construction company had donated materials and labor for the memorial's foundation, while his personal contribution had covered much of the stone carving costs. Peter watched now as final preparations were made around the memorial. Flowers had been arriving since early morning, brought by families, local organizations, and community groups. Each arrangement told its own story, from the simple wildflower bouquets picked by children to the formal wreaths sent by military organizations and veteran groups from across the region. The memorial's design incorporated elements that spoke to both the specific history of Corsham and the broader experience of wartime Britain. The central column bore the inscription in memory of those who served 1939 to 1945, followed by the names of the confirmed dead. Below that, a secondary inscription read, "And all who served from this place," acknowledging that many service records have been lost and that the true number of Corsham's wartime participants might never be known. Around the base of the memorial, smaller stones bore the emblems of different military services that had operated from the area. The RAF wings were prominently featured, but the Royal Navy anchor and Army insignia were also represented, reflecting the diverse nature of wartime service. Eleanor's research had uncovered evidence of Royal Navy personnel who had been temporarily assigned to the underground facilities, as well as Army units that had used Corsham as a staging area. The inclusion of civilian casualties had been one of the more difficult decisions faced by the organizing committee. Several Corsham residents had been killed during air raids, and their families felt strongly that these deaths deserve recognition alongside military casualties. After months of discussion and consultation with families, a separate section of the memorial had been dedicated to civilians lost to enemy action. As the time for the ceremony approached, Margaret Fletcher found herself thinking about her father's letter that had arrived 3 days after news of his death. In it, he had written about the beauty of the Wiltshire countryside and his hope that after the war, he might return to settle permanently in Corsham with her mother. That dream had died with him over the channel, but, in a way, the memorial represented the fulfillment of his wish to be remembered in the place he had come to love during his brief time there. The town's mayor, Councillor Janet Morrison, reviewed her notes one final time before the ceremony began. As David Morrison's wife, she had watched the memorial take shape in their family workshop before being transported and installed in square. She had also witnessed the emotional impact the project had on her husband, who had thrown himself into the work with an intensity that sometimes worried her. David had insisted on carving each name by hand, refusing offers to use modern engraving techniques. He wanted the memorial to bear the mark of human craftsmanship, to reflect the personal nature of each individual loss. The result was a surface that seemed to pulse with life, each letter slightly different, each name carrying its own character. The weather had cooperated beautifully for the ceremony. November in Wiltshire could be bitter and wet, but today dawned clear and still, with weak autumn sunlight filtering through the clouds. Eleanor Hartwell had joked during planning meetings that the war generation was looking down and ensuring perfect conditions for their day of recognition. Local media representatives had arrived early, setting up cameras and interviewing residents about their connections to the memorial. The story had attracted attention from regional television stations and newspapers, partly because of the royal visit, but mostly because of the human interest angle. Stories like Margaret Fletcher's resonated with audiences who understood that every family had its war stories, its gaps, and losses that echoed across generations. The Memorial Committee had worked hard to ensure that today's ceremony would be accessible to residents of all ages and physical abilities. Seating areas have been designated for elderly participants, while clear sight lines have been maintained for those who prefer to stand. Local volunteers have been stationed throughout the square to assist anyone who needed help or information about the proceedings. As the clock in the parish church tower approached 10 o'clock, a subtle change came over the gathered crowd. Conversations became quieter, children moved closer to their parents, and an air of anticipation settled over the square. Margaret Fletcher clutched her father's photograph more tightly, feeling his presence in a way that she hadn't experienced in years. The memorial stood ready to receive its final tribute, the culmination of 3 years of research, planning, and community effort. Each name carved into its surface represented not just a life lost, but a family forever changed, a community touched by sacrifice, and a nation that had endured its darkest hour and emerged victorious. Eleanor Hartwell looked around at the faces surrounding her and felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the successful completion of a difficult project. She saw healing in those faces, closure for some, and peace for others. Most importantly, she saw remembrance being passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that the sacrifices represented by the memorial would never be forgotten. The stage was set for Queen Camilla's arrival, and the ceremony that would formally dedicate the memorial to its sacred purpose. But, in many ways, the most important work had already been accomplished. The community had come together to honor its fallen. The families had found a focus for their long-held grief, and the town of Corsham had reclaimed its place in the larger story of Britain's wartime experience. As the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance, Margaret Fletcher whispered a quiet prayer for her father and all those whose names would soon be blessed with royal recognition. Today, Squadron Leader James Fletcher and his fallen comrades would finally receive the honor they had earned 78 years ago in the skies over a world at war. The black Bentley rounded the corner on a high street with practiced precision, its royal standard fluttering gently in the autumn breeze. Inside, Queen Camilla reviewed the final notes prepared by her private secretary, absorbing details about the family she would meet and the stories behind the memorial that awaited her tribute. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah Troughton, sat quietly beside her, ready to assist with the carefully orchestrated ceremony that would mark the culmination of years of community effort. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins spoke quietly into her radio as the royal convoy approached the town square. Security arrangements had been coordinated down to the minute, but she felt the familiar tension that accompanied any high-profile public event. The intimate nature of today's ceremony presented unique challenges, as the royal protection officers had worked to maintain security while preserving the personal atmosphere the community had requested. As the convoy came to a stop near the memorial, Margaret Fletcher felt her heart racing with anticipation. She had never expected to meet royalty, certainly not in connection with her father's memory. The invitation to represent war families during the ceremony had come through Eleanor Hartwell, who had identified Margaret as someone whose story embodied the long journey from loss to remembrance that the memorial represented. Queen Camilla stepped from the vehicle with characteristic grace, immediately taking in the scene before her. The memorial stood proudly in the center of the square, its Portland stone surface gleaming in the morning light. Around its base, flowers had been arranged with care, each arrangement representing different aspects of the community's connection to the war years. Mayor Janet Morrison stepped forward to greet the Queen, her nervousness carefully concealed behind years of public speaking experience. The formal introductions had been rehearsed multiple times, but meeting royalty in person always carried an element of the unexpected. Queen Camilla's warm smile immediately put Janet at ease, and the mayor found herself genuinely enjoying the conversation about the memorial's significance to the community. Eleanor Hartwell waited nearby, clutching a leather-bound portfolio containing the research that had made today's ceremony possible. Inside were photographs, letters, service records, and personal testimonies that brought life to the names carved into the memorial. She had been selected to provide the historical context for the Queen's visit, and she felt the weight of representing not just her own research, but the collective memory of an entire community. The crowd gathered respectfully as Queen Camilla began her tour of the memorial, pausing to read names and listen to brief explanations of their significance. Her genuine interest in each story was evident, and several family members who had been nervous about meeting royalty found themselves relaxing as she asked thoughtful questions about their loved one's service. When the Queen reached Margaret Fletcher, the elderly woman felt momentarily overwhelmed by emotion. She had practiced what she would say, but standing face-to-face with royalty while holding her father's photograph seemed surreal. Queen Camilla noticed the picture immediately and asked gently about Squadron Leader Fletcher's service, listening intently as Margaret shared her father's story with a voice that grew steadier with each word. The memorial itself seemed to command attention as the ceremony progressed. David Morrison watched from a respectful distance as the Queen examined his handiwork, noting details that spoke to the care and craftsmanship that had gone into every element. The stone carving had been a labor of love, but seeing it serve its intended purpose of bringing comfort to families like Margaret's made every hour of work worthwhile. Local children from Corsham Primary School had been positioned near the memorial, their young faces serious with the importance of the occasion. Their teacher, Miss Jennifer Hayes, had spent weeks preparing them for today's ceremony, teaching them about World War II and the sacrifice represented by the memorial. Several children held small flags, while others had prepared drawings depicting what they had learned about their town's wartime history. Queen Camilla's interaction with the school children proved to be one of the most touching moments of the ceremony. She knelt down to speak with 8-year-old Tommy Richardson, whose great-grandfather's name appeared on the memorial. Tommy had prepared questions about what it was like to be queen, but found himself instead talking about his great-grandfather's medals, which his family had shown him in preparation for today's event. The formal proceedings began with a brief welcome from Mayor Morrison, who spoke about the memorial's journey from concept to reality. Her words were carefully chosen to honor both the fallen and the families who had waited decades for this recognition. She emphasized that today's ceremony represented not an ending, but a new beginning in how the community would remember and honor its wartime heritage. Eleanor Hartwell stepped forward to provide historical context for the memorial, drawing on years of research to paint a picture of Corsham during World War II. She spoke of young pilots arriving at RAF Corsham for training, many of them barely out of their teens, carrying the hopes and fears of a nation at war. Her presentation brought the memorial's names to life, transforming them from inscriptions on stone to real people with dreams, families, and futures cut short by war. The Reverend Michael Thornton offered a blessing that acknowledged multiple faiths represented in the community while honoring the universal nature of sacrifice and remembrance. His words carried special meaning for families who had struggled with questions of faith in the face of devastating loss. The blessing encompassed not just the fallen, but also the families who had carried their grief for decades, and the community that had finally found a way to honor their sacrifice appropriately. As the formal ceremony progressed, Queen Camilla's presence seemed to elevate the entire proceeding beyond a simple local event. Her genuine engagement with each family's story transformed what might have been a routine royal duty into something deeply personal and meaningful. When she spoke with Mrs. Dorothy Whitman, whose husband had served as ground crew at RAF Corsham, the Queen's questions about wartime life on the base led to an animated conversation that captured the attention of everyone present. The memorial's design allowed for multiple people to approach and pay their respects simultaneously, and Queen Camilla encouraged families to join her as she examined different sections. This informal approach created opportunities for spontaneous conversations and shared memories that enriched the entire ceremony. Rather than a formal presentation to royalty, the event evolved into a community gathering where stories flowed naturally and connections formed between people who shared common experiences. Local photographer Martin Davies, who had been documenting the memorial project since its inception, captured moments of genuine emotion as families finally saw their loved ones honored in the presence of royalty. His photographs would become important historical documents, preserving not just the ceremony itself, but the faces and emotions of people who had waited a lifetime for this recognition. The memorial's inscription acknowledging all who served from this place took on special significance as Queen Camilla learned about the various roles Corsham had played during the war. Beyond the better-known activities at RAF Corsham, Eleanor's research had uncovered evidence of codebreakers working in underground facilities, women's auxiliary services providing crucial support functions, and civilian defense teams that had maintained community morale during the darkest days of the Blitz. Peter Ashworth, whose construction company had contributed significantly to the memorial's creation, found himself explaining to the Queen the practical challenges of creating a permanent memorial in a historic town center. The technical aspects of the project had been as complex as the emotional ones, requiring careful coordination with heritage authorities and local planning committees to ensure the memorial enhanced rather than disrupted the town's character. Queen Camilla's questions about the research process led to fascinating discussions about how military records from World War II had been maintained and accessed. Eleanor Hartwell explained the detective work involved in tracking down service information for men whose records had been damaged or lost over the decades. The conversation highlighted the broader challenges facing communities across Britain that were trying to properly honor their wartime heritage. The presence of multiple generations at the ceremony created natural opportunities for sharing stories and passing on memories. Queen Camilla observed several instances where elderly residents were explaining details to younger family members, ensuring that wartime experiences would not be lost with the passing of those who remembered them firsthand. This intergenerational aspect seemed to particularly please the Queen, who commented on the importance of maintaining these connections to history. As the time approached for Queen Camilla to place her floral tribute, the ceremony took on a more solemn tone. The tribute itself had been carefully selected to represent both royal recognition and personal meaning. The flowers included roses for remembrance, rosemary for memory, and poppies for sacrifice, arranged in a way that would remain appropriate long after the ceremony concluded. Local florist Amanda Crawford had been honored to prepare the royal tribute, working with palace representatives to create an arrangement that balanced formality with personal meaning. Her shop had also provided many of the family tributes surrounding the memorial, and she understood better than most how flowers could express emotions that words could not capture. The Queen's approach to the memorial for the tribute placement was marked by genuine reverence. She paused before the central inscription, reading the words slowly and taking time to absorb their meaning. Her placement of the flowers was deliberate and respectful, accompanied by a moment of silent reflection that seemed to honor not just the names on the memorial, but all who had served their country during its darkest hour. Margaret Fletcher watched through tears as Queen Camilla's tribute joined the dozens of other floral arrangements surrounding the memorial. The sight of royal flowers alongside simple bouquets brought by local families seemed to perfectly capture the democratic nature of sacrifice and remembrance. Her father's photograph, which she still clutched in her hands, seemed to connect her directly to this moment of recognition. The ceremony continued with brief remarks from Queen Camilla, who spoke eloquently about the importance of community memorials in maintaining the connection between past and present. Her words acknowledged the specific sacrifice represented by the Corsham Memorial, while placing it in the broader context of a nation's gratitude to those who had defended freedom during World War II. The Queen's speech included personal reflections on the importance of remembrance and the role that communities play in keeping history alive for future generations. She praised the years of research and fundraising that had made the memorial possible, emphasizing that such projects represented the best qualities of British community spirit and dedication to honoring those who had served. As the formal ceremony began to wind down, Queen Camilla continued to engage with families and community members, showing no signs of hurry or impatience. Her genuine interest in each person's story created an atmosphere of warmth and connection that would be remembered long after the royal visit concluded. The memorial had received its final tribute, but the real significance of the day lay in the bonds formed between past and present, between sacrifice and recognition, between a community and its history. The afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the town square as the formal ceremony transitioned into something more intimate and personal. Queen Camilla had exceeded the scheduled time for her visit, but her genuine engagement with the community had created opportunities for conversations that went far beyond the planned program. Local residents who had initially felt nervous about meeting royalty found themselves sharing deeply personal stories about family members whose names now grace the memorial. Eleanor Hartwell seized the opportunity to present the Queen with a specially prepared copy of her research, bound in leather and containing photographs and documents that told the complete story of Corsham's wartime experience. The presentation had been planned as a brief formality, but Queen Camilla's evident interest in the historical details led to an extended discussion about the detective work involved in tracking down lost records and forgotten stories. The research volume contained revelations that had surprised even Eleanor during her years of investigation. Hidden among official records, she had discovered evidence of a secret intelligence operation that had used Corsham as a base for monitoring German communications. The operation had remained classified for decades, and many of the personnel involved had never received public recognition for their contribution to the war effort. Queen Camilla's fascination with these hidden histories reflected her broader interest in uncovering stories that had been overlooked by official accounts. She asked detailed questions about how Eleanor had gained access to classified materials and what other secrets might still be waiting to be discovered in archives across the country. The conversation highlighted the ongoing work needed to ensure that all wartime contributions received appropriate recognition. Margaret Fletcher found herself part of a small group gathered around the Queen as stories flowed naturally from one family to another. Mrs. Dorothy Whitman shared memories of her late husband's service as ground crew, describing how he had maintained the aircraft that carried pilots like Margaret's father into combat. The connections between different aspects of the base's operations became clear as families realized how their loved ones had been part of an integrated effort to keep fighters flying. Young Tommy Richardson, whose earlier conversation with the Queen had captivated onlookers, returned with his grandmother to share more details about his great-grandfather's service. Mrs. Joyce Richardson had been too emotional during the formal ceremony to speak at length, but the relaxed atmosphere now allowed her to tell stories she had preserved for decades about her father's experiences as a wireless operator at RAF Corsham. The memorial's design encouraged these informal gatherings, with its broad base providing space for multiple groups to congregate while maintaining clear sight lines to the inscribed names. David Morrison watched with satisfaction as his creation fulfilled its intended purpose of bringing people together around shared memories and common experiences. The stone's surface seemed to warm in the afternoon light, becoming more welcoming and accessible than the austere monument some had feared. Local media representatives found themselves documenting not just a royal visit, but a genuine community celebration that revealed the deep connections between past and present. Television reporter Sarah Mitchell, who had initially come to cover the royal ceremony, realized she was witnessing something much more significant as families shared stories that had been kept private for generations. The presence of multiple generations at the gathering created natural opportunities for education and remembrance. Queen Camilla observed teenage students from the local secondary school listening intently as elderly residents described wartime rationing, blackout procedures, and the constant anxiety that had characterized daily life during the war years. These conversations provided historical education that no textbook could match. Peter Ashworth approached the Queen with his own family connection to share, bringing forward his elderly aunt, Rose Ashworth, who had worked in the base's communications center during the war. Rose, now 93, had rarely spoken about her wartime service, but the significance of the occasion and the Queen's genuine interest encouraged her to share memories she had kept locked away for decades. Rose's stories revealed another layer of Corsham's wartime importance that had not been fully appreciated during the memorial planning process. The Communications Center had been responsible for coordinating flight operations across a network of bases, making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for pilots in combat. Her work had been classified for decades, leaving her unable to discuss her contributions even with close family members. Queen Camilla's conversation with Rose Ashworth attracted the attention of other families who had suspected that their relatives had been involved in classified activities, but had never been able to confirm details. The gathering became an impromptu historical revelation session as elderly residents shared fragments of information that began to form a more complete picture of the base's true significance during the war. The memorial committee had planned for a 1-hour royal visit, but 3 hours later, Queen Camilla continued to engage with community members who approached with new stories and connections. Her private secretary had quietly rescheduled the remainder of the day's appointments, recognizing that something special was happening in Corsham that deserved the Queen's full attention. Local historian Eleanor Hartwell found herself taking notes on new information revealed during these conversations, realizing that her research had only scratched the surface of Corsham's wartime story. Several families mentioned relatives whose service records had been lost or destroyed, but whose contributions were now being acknowledged for the first time through shared memories and family testimonies. The afternoon gathering also revealed connections between Corsham and other wartime operations across Britain. Mrs. Agnes Townsend shared letters from her brother, who had been transferred from Corsham to Bletchley Park, the famous code-breaking center. His correspondence, carefully preserved by the family, provided insights into how personnel had moved between secret installations as the war progressed. Queen Camilla's interest in these broader connections led to discussions about how communities across Britain were working to uncover and honor their wartime heritage. The Corsham Memorial represented one example of a movement that was happening nationwide as the last generation of war survivors worked to ensure their stories would not be lost to time. Children and teenagers present at the gathering found themselves drawn into conversations with elderly residents who had lived through the war years. These interactions created educational opportunities that supplemented formal history lessons with personal testimonies that brought the past to life. Queen Camilla observed these exchanges with evident pleasure, commenting on the importance of maintaining these connections between generations. The memorial's inscription acknowledging all who served from this place took on expanded meaning as new stories emerged about civilian contributions to the war effort. Local women who had worked in munitions factories, farmers who had increased food production under government direction, and shopkeepers who had maintained community morale during difficult times were all part of Corsham's wartime story. David Morrison found himself explaining the technical aspects of creating the memorial to Queen Camilla, who showed genuine interest in the craftsmanship involved in hand-carving each name. The Queen's questions about the stone selection, carving techniques, and installation challenges led to a detailed discussion about the practical aspects of creating permanent memorials that would withstand decades of weather and public use. The conversation with David Morrison revealed the emotional impact that creating the memorial had on the craftsman himself. He described the responsibility he had felt while carving each name, knowing that families would visit for decades to remember their loved ones. The Queen's recognition of this emotional burden validated David's decision to approach the project as more than just another commission. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering began to take on the characteristics of a community festival rather than a formal ceremony. Local businesses had remained closed during the morning ceremony, but several shop owners had begun offering refreshments to families and visitors who were staying to participate in the extended conversations. The spontaneous hospitality reflected the community spirit that had made the memorial project possible. Queen Camilla's acceptance of a cup of tea from the local tea room created another informal moment that endeared her to residents who had initially felt intimidated by royal protocol. Her willingness to sit on a bench near the memorial and continue conversations with families demonstrated an approach to royal duties that prioritized genuine engagement over ceremonial formality. The extended gathering also provided opportunities for families to connect with each other for the first time. Margaret Fletcher found herself talking with other families who had lost relatives in air operations, sharing experiences of growing up without fathers and the long journey toward finding peace with their loss. These connections have been an unexpected benefit of the Memorial Project, creating support networks that had developed naturally through shared experiences. Local photographer Martin Davies continued documenting the afternoon's events, recognizing that the informal conversations and connections were as historically significant as the formal ceremony. His photographs captured moments of genuine emotion and discovery as families learned new details about their relatives' service and the broader context of Corsham's wartime importance. The Memorial Committee members, who had worked for 3 years to make this day possible, found themselves reflecting on how the event had exceeded their highest expectations. What had begun as a project to honor the fallen had evolved into something much larger, a community rediscovery of its own history and a strengthening of bonds between neighbors who shared common experiences of loss and pride. Eleanor Hartwell realized that today's gathering had generated more new information about Corsham's wartime experience than months of traditional research. The combination of royal recognition, community gathering, and shared storytelling had created an environment where people felt comfortable sharing memories they had kept private for decades. Queen Camilla's decision to extend her visit had transformed what might have been a routine memorial dedication into a genuine historical event. Her presence had validated the importance of community-based remembrance while encouraging families to share stories that enriched everyone's understanding of the past. As the afternoon shadows grew longer, the gathering began to wind down naturally, but not before Queen Camilla had met with virtually every family connected to the memorial. Her final conversations focused on the future of remembrance, discussing how communities like Corsham could continue honoring their wartime heritage while ensuring that younger generations understood the significance of the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. The success of the extended gathering proved that formal ceremonies, while important, could not capture the full significance of community remembrance. The informal conversations, shared stories, and new connections that had emerged during the afternoon represented the true purpose of memorials, bringing people together around shared values of remembrance, respect, and gratitude for those who had served. The evening light cast a golden glow across the memorial as Queen Camilla prepared for her departure, but the impact of her extended visit would resonate through Corsham for years to come. What had begun as a formal ceremony to place a final floral tribute had evolved into something far more significant, a community transformation that honored the past while strengthening bonds for the future. Margaret Fletcher stood beside the memorial, still holding her father's photograph, but Her tears now carried joy alongside the sorrow she had carried for 78 years. The royal recognition of her father's sacrifice had provided a closure she never expected to find. But, more importantly, the connection she had made with other families during the afternoon had given her a sense of belonging to something larger than her individual grief. The conversations throughout the day had revealed that Margaret's experience of growing up without a father killed in the war was far from unique in Corsham. Mrs. Patricia Webb, whose father had been killed while serving with RAF Corsham support staff, had shared remarkably similar experiences of living with absence and unanswered questions. The two women, strangers when the day began, had formed a friendship based on shared understanding that would continue long after the ceremonies concluded. Eleanor Hartwell found herself overwhelmed by the volume of new information that had emerged during the extended gathering. Her leather portfolio, which she had thought contained the complete story of Corsham's wartime experience, now seemed like just the beginning of a much larger historical project. Families had shared documents, photographs, and stories that would require months of additional research to properly verify and incorporate into the historical record. The revelation that several families possessed classified documents and restricted photographs from their relatives' wartime service opened up entirely new avenues of research. Eleanor realized she would need to work with military historians and archival specialists to properly evaluate and preserve these materials, which could significantly expand understanding of secret operations that had been based in and around Corsham. Queen Camilla's final conversations before departure focused on the future preservation of the stories she had heard throughout the day. She encouraged Eleanor to consider publishing a comprehensive history of Corsham during World War II, suggesting that the research could serve as a model for other communities working to uncover their own hidden wartime heritage. The Queen's interest in the broader implications of community-based historical research reflected her understanding that similar stories were waiting to be discovered across Britain. Many small towns and villages had played crucial roles during World War II, but their contributions had been overshadowed by larger, better documented operations. The success of the Corsham project could inspire other communities to undertake similar investigations into their own past. David Morrison watched as families continued to gather around his memorial, even as the formal ceremonies concluded. Children who had been restless during the morning's proceedings now listened intently as elderly relatives shared stories prompted by their reading of names carved into the stone. The memorial was already fulfilling its intended purpose of connecting generations through shared remembrance. The success of the memorial project had exceeded David's expectations in ways that went far beyond the craftsmanship he had contributed. Seeing families find comfort and connection around his work validated his decision to approach the project as a labor of love rather than a simple commission. The memorial would stand for decades, but its impact on the community was already transforming how residents understood their own history. Local businessman Peter Ashworth found himself considering how the day's success could be built upon to create lasting benefits for the community. The royal visit had attracted national media attention to Corsham, highlighting not just the memorial, but the town's broader historical significance. This recognition could potentially attract heritage tourism and educational visits that would support local businesses while spreading knowledge of the area's wartime importance. Peter's aunt Rose Ashworth, whose stories about classified communications work have been among the day's most surprising revelations, experienced a profound sense of relief at finally being able to discuss her wartime service openly. For decades, she had carried the burden of keeping important historical experiences to herself, unable to share even with close family members because of secrecy restrictions that had long since been lifted. The memorial committee members gathered for a brief reflection as Queen Camilla's convoy departed, recognizing that they had accomplished something far more significant than their original goals. What had begun as a simple project to honor local war dead had evolved into a community-wide historical rediscovery that strengthened social bonds while preserving important stories for future generations. Mayor Janet Morrison reflected on how the project had changed her own understanding of the town she had led for several years. the stories revealed during the research process, and the ceremony had given her a much deeper appreciation for Corsham's historical significance and the resilience of its residents during the most challenging period in modern British history. The success of the memorial ceremony also demonstrated the power of grassroots historical preservation efforts. While national museums and archives played important roles in maintaining historical records, the Corsham project showed how local communities could uncover and preserve stories that might otherwise be lost to time. Local media coverage of the event extended well beyond the royal visit, focusing on the human stories that had emerged throughout the day. Television reporter Sarah Mitchell found herself planning a follow-up documentary about the broader impact of community memorial projects, recognizing that the Corsham story represented something happening across Britain as communities worked to honor their wartime heritage. The children who had participated in the ceremony would carry forward memories that would influence their understanding of history for the rest of their lives. Tommy Richardson, who had captivated Queen Camilla with his questions and enthusiasm, had experienced a direct connection to his family's military heritage that would likely influence his future educational and career choices. Miss Jennifer Hayes, the primary school teacher who had prepared students for the ceremony, realized that the experience had provided educational opportunities that could not be replicated in traditional classroom settings. The combination of historical research, personal testimony, and royal recognition had created learning experiences that would remain with students long after they moved on to secondary education. The memorial's location in the town square ensured that it would become a focal point for future remembrance activities. Annual ceremonies could build on the foundation established by today's royal visit, while the memorial would serve as a gathering place for families and community groups throughout the year. The flowers surrounding the memorial, ranging from Queen Camilla's formal tribute to children's hand-picked wildflowers, created a visual representation of how remembrance encompassed all levels of society. The democratic nature of grief and gratitude had been evident throughout the day as royal recognition validated personal losses, while community support helped individuals process emotions they had carried for decades. Eleanor Hartwell's research had proven that local history projects could uncover nationally significant stories that had been overlooked by traditional academic historians. The secret operations revealed during her investigation suggested that similar discoveries were waiting to be made in communities across Britain, where classified activities had left few public records, but many family memories. The memorial's inscription acknowledging all who served from this place had proven prophetic as the ceremony revealed contributions that went far beyond military service in the traditional sense. Civilian workers, support staff, and family members who had maintained home front morale were all part of the wartime story that deserved recognition and remembrance. As darkness fell over Corsham, the memorial stood illuminated by newly installed lighting that would ensure its visibility throughout the year. The lights had been donated by local businesses in recognition of the memorial's significance to the community, representing a commitment to maintaining the site as a place of honor and reflection. The success of Queen Camilla's visit had demonstrated the positive impact that royal recognition could have on local heritage projects. Her genuine interest in the stories and people she met had elevated what might have been a routine ceremony into something genuinely meaningful for everyone involved. Margaret Fletcher made one final visit to the memorial before heading home, placing her hand on the stone near her father's name. The physical connection to his memory felt stronger now that his sacrifice had been officially recognized and his story shared with others who understood the long journey from loss to acceptance to peace. The memorial project had begun with a simple goal of honoring the fallen, but its completion had revealed much larger themes about community, memory, and the importance of preserving stories for future generations. The connections formed between families, the historical discoveries made during research, and the healing that had occurred through shared remembrance represented achievements that went far beyond the creation of a physical monument. The day's events had proven that remembrance was not a passive activity, but an ongoing process that required community engagement and intergenerational dialogue. The stories shared during Queen Camilla's extended visit had enriched everyone's understanding of the past, while creating obligations to ensure that these narratives would be preserved and passed forward. As Corsham settled into evening quiet, the memorial stood as a permanent reminder of sacrifice and service, but also as evidence of what communities could accomplish when they came together around shared values of remembrance and respect. The royal tribute had been placed, but the real work of honoring the fallen would continue through the daily acts of remembrance and storytelling that the memorial would inspire for generations to come. The success of the project offered hope that other communities facing similar challenges of forgotten history and unrecognized sacrifice could follow Corsham's example, using local resources and community dedication to uncover and honor their own hidden heritage. Queen Camilla's final tribute had concluded the formal ceremony, but it had also marked the beginning of a new chapter in how Corsham would remember and celebrate its remarkable wartime legacy.